We have become accustomed to the idea that humans are the absolute masters of this planet, standing at the top of the food chain, with no natural predators, with no rivals. But Earth's history has not always operated according to that logic. Imagine a dense, humid tropical rainforest where rain falls incessantly and sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. At the mouth of a cave, amidst the hazy mist and the hum of insects, the silhouette of a human appears. At first glance, it looks like us. But in a split second, your brain realizes something is wrong. The body proportions are off. The head is too large, the legs are too short, and the posture is unlike any adult human you have ever seen. In 2003, at Liang Bua Cave on the island of Flores, a group of archaeologists truly came face to face with that creature, not in their imagination, but in the form of a human skeleton buried for tens of thousands of years. Initially, they believed they were excavating the remains of a child suffering from some kind of pathology. However, subsequent analyses forced them to completely reject this hypothesis. The skeleton belonged to an adult woman, about 30 years old, with a height in life of only about 1 meter and a brain capacity significantly smaller than that of modern humans. There were no signs of deformity and no evidence to suggest this was an abnormal individual. She represented a different human species that once existed alongside our ancestors. The world calls them hobbits, but behind that seemingly harmless name lies a story that is anything but a fairy tale. This was not just a failed evolutionary branch, but the consequence of absolute isolation. A group of humans trapped on an isolated island where nature cared little for their intelligence or their primitive tools. Flores was not a place to be conquered. It was a biological prison, and humans had lost their dominance there long before we even realized it. To understand why these tiny humans existed on Flores, one must first understand that islands always operate under biological rules very different from those of the mainland. When a population is isolated for a long time with limited space and resources in constant shortage, evolution no longer favors large size or absolute strength. Instead, it begins trimming every species until only what is truly necessary for survival remains. This phenomenon is known by biologists as Foster's Rule, or the island rule. According to this rule, large animal species tend to shrink over time to reduce their energy requirements, while small species may grow larger due to fewer competitors and lower predatory pressure. On paper, this is a logical adjustment that helps the ecosystem reach a new state of equilibrium. But on Flores Island, this rule operated in an extreme way, creating a biological world where modern humans would find it hard to feel safe. Tens of thousands of years ago, Flores was home to stegodon, ancient relatives of elephants. Due to the effects of the island rule, they were significantly smaller than today's elephants, yet were still creatures weighing hundreds of kilograms, possessing long tusks and enough power to kill anyone who came too close. For Homo floresiensis, the stegodon was both a strategic food source and a survival gamble. Hunting one individual could feed the whole group for many days, but just one gore or a single misstep was enough to end the life of the tiny hunter. Conversely, creatures that normally had to hide in the shadows grew beyond their familiar sizes. Giant rats, some as large as small dogs, appeared in high densities, competing for food sources and potentially even attacking children or weak individuals. In an environment lacking medium-sized predators like those on the mainland, this ecological niche allowed rodents to thrive. becoming a permanent part of daily danger. More importantly, Flores was not just dangerous because of individual creatures, but because of how its entire ecosystem was arranged. Homo floresiensis did not hold a dominant position, but neither were they at the bottom of the food chain. They were stuck in the middle, intelligent enough to make stone tools, coordinate in groups, and plan hunts, but not large, fast, or strong enough to overpower their surroundings. Every trip out of the cave held potential risk, for just one small mistake could turn the hunter into prey. The geographical isolation of Flores made the situation even more grim. Even during periods of lower sea levels due to glaciation, the island remained surrounded by deep straits, making active migration almost impossible. Once they set foot on Flores, there was no way back for humans. There was no genetic influx from the outside, no chance to fix unsuitable adaptations. It was within that closed and harsh environment that Homo floresiensis gradually became a product of this island. They did not evolve to conquer Flores, but to endure it. And the price of that existence was an increasingly small body, forced to adapt to a world where the rules of the game no longer favored humans. When Homo floresiensis was first announced to the scientific world, the most common reaction was skepticism. Many argued that this was just an individual Homo sapiens with a pathology, or an outdated branch of ancient humans that had not yet evolved completely. However, subsequent studies gradually dismissed these simple hypotheses. The skeletons found at Liang Bua Cave did not show signs of individual pathology, but rather exhibited a set of consistent characteristics repeated across many individuals. This showed that Homo floresiensis was not an exception, but a representative of a population that had existed stably for a long time. Physically, Homo floresiensis had an average height of only about 1 meter, with a light body weight, relatively long arms, and short legs. Their feet were large and flat, with almost no arch, a characteristic that made their gait less efficient than modern humans when traveling long distances. This structure suggests they did not evolve to run fast or with endurance, but were better suited for moving slowly within a familiar range. On Flores, where dense and rugged jungle terrain predominated, the inability to accelerate quickly when facing danger was a life-threatening limitation. The brain capacity of Homo floresiensis was significantly smaller than that of Homo sapiens, yet archaeological evidence suggests they did not lack the cognitive capacity necessary to survive. Stone tools found in the same geological layer show they knew how to select materials, intentionally create sharp edges, and use tools for specific tasks. Some researchers suggest that their small brains underwent a process of functional restructuring, in which areas directly related to survival were prioritized instead of expanding in overall size. This remains a hypothesis, but it helps explain why the intelligence of Homo floresiensis was not proportional to brain volume. What makes Homo floresiensis particularly haunting to modern humans lies not just in their measurements or body structure, but in the feeling of imagining being face to face with them. A chinless face, a backward-sloping forehead, and deep eye sockets create an expression that is both familiar and alien. If one were to see such an individual in the forest today, the human brain would likely react with an immediate sense of unease. Because this is a creature that clearly belongs to our family, yet does not follow the proportions that the brain is accustomed to recognizing. The daily life of Homo floresiensis was perhaps organized in small groups, relying on familiarity with the terrain around caves and safe foraging routes. This is speculation based on the survival patterns of other ancient human species, as there is no direct evidence of their social structure. However, in a risk-filled environment like Flores, living in isolation was nearly impossible. The presence of others of their kind not only helped increase foraging efficiency, but also served as an early warning system against dangers. Hunting stegodon, if it indeed took place, was likely the most dangerous activity they faced. With a height only at the hip or lower than their prey, Homo floresiensis could not rely on strength or reach. Scientists suggest they might have utilized terrain, natural traps, or group coordination to weaken the animal before approaching. This is still only a hypothesis, but it reflects the level of recklessness that each hunt might have required. A kick, a backward step in the wrong direction, or a delayed reflex could all lead to a fatal injury. Even activities that seem safer, such as picking fruit, digging up tubers, or scavenging animal carcasses, were not simple at all. With a lower line of sight than modern humans, the world of Homo floresiensis was always obscured by tall grass, thickets, and fallen tree trunks. Every time they bent down, it meant trading off the ability to observe their surroundings. In that environment, vigilance was not a momentary state, but a continuous condition for existence. Homo floresiensis were not weak or inferior creatures. They were intelligent in a way suited to their world, but were limited by a body that allowed no room for error. It was this contradiction between intellect and physique that turned every day on Flores into a prolonged challenge, where humans were no longer the center of the ecosystem, but only a fragile part of an unforgiving world. On the island of Flores, Homo floresiensis not only had to contend with the harsh environment and their own biological limitations, but also had to live in an ecosystem where humans held no control. This was not a world where predators stood at a distance, rarely appearing, but a place where death could be hiding right behind every bush, every bend in the forest. For these small humans, fear was not a momentary emotion, but a permanent state of existence. The most obvious and dangerous threat came from the Komodo dragon, the largest carnivorous reptile still in existence today. Even to modern humans, tall and armed, the Komodo remains a predator that many indigenous communities must be wary of. For Homo floresiensis, standing less than a meter tall and unable to run fast, the disparity in size and strength was almost absolute. An adult Komodo can be over 3 meters long, with a mass several times that of an adult hobbit's body, making any encounter a potential disaster. The way the Komodo hunts makes the danger even more terrifying. They do not need to kill their prey immediately. A deep bite, causing blood loss and poisoning, is enough to exhaust the victim for hours or days afterward. For Homo floresiensis, with no medical knowledge and no ability to treat serious wounds, such a bite was almost synonymous with a slow death sentence. Even if they escaped in the first moment, their bodies still faced an inevitable death. Imagine a normal foraging session. A group of Homo floresiensis leaves the cave in the early morning, moving through the familiar, humid forest. While they focus on scanning the ground for tubers and fruit, a Komodo dragon might be lying motionless in the shade, its heavy belly pressed against the ground, almost blending into the surrounding landscape. With a low line of sight and dense terrain, detecting the predator before it lunges is extremely difficult. In that moment, there is no time to think or coordinate. The only reflex is panic. However, the Komodo was not the only threat. Another predator, less well known but no less haunting, may have existed alongside Homo floresiensis, Leptoptylos robustus, an extinct species of giant marabou stork. With an estimated height of up to about 1.8 meters, this bird was nearly twice as tall as Homo floresiensis, possessing long legs, a large beak, and neck muscles strong enough to handle prey of significant size. There is no direct evidence that Leptoptylos robustus regularly hunted humans, and this must be clearly emphasized. However, many researchers suggest that this bird may have been a scavenger or an opportunistic predator, similar to extant marabou species today. In an ecosystem lacking medium-sized carnivores, it is a plausible hypothesis, though not yet confirmed, that a large bird species would exploit unusual food sources, including weak Homo floresiensis individuals or young children. If looking at the world from the perspective of a Homo floresiensis, this threat takes on an entirely new dimension. You move through grass nearly as high as your head, your vision severely limited. The surrounding sounds suddenly become unusually silent. Then a large shadow falls from above, not from the bushes or from behind, but from the sky. In that moment, the brain is forced to confront a reality it was never familiar with. Humans were not only hunted from the ground, but could also become prey from above. If this hypothesis is correct, Flores may be one of the very few places in evolutionary history where humans had to live in fear of being hunted by birds. With a small body, unable to run fast, and lacking long-range weapons, Homo floresiensis had almost no way to effectively resist such a surprise attack. Their existence was therefore always tied to prolonged stress, where every excursion from the cave was a gamble for survival. Living among such predators, Homo floresiensis never had a true sense of safety. On the island of Flores, humans were not at the top of the food chain. They were just a small creature, trying to survive among very real monsters in a world that did not favor their intelligence or origin. Beyond direct encounters, the presence of these predators also created a lasting psychological pressure on Homo floresiensis. Unlike modern humans, they could not clearly distinguish between safe time and dangerous time. On Flores, every moment outside the cave held potential risk, and that forced them to maintain a state of nearly constant vigilance. Survival stress came not only from actual attacks, but from the constant anxiety that any sound or movement could signal that death was approaching. This may have profoundly influenced how Homo floresiensis organized their lives. Researchers suggest they likely minimized solo travel, preferring to stay near caves and familiar areas where the terrain was memorized and hazards could be somewhat predicted. This is not direct evidence, but rather a logical inference based on the survival behaviors of many animals and other archaic humans in predator-rich environments. In that context, the presence of Komodo dragons or giant bird species was not just a physical threat, but a factor shaping the entire rhythm of Homo floresiensis' existence. Their existence was constrained not only by their body size, but by a world where individuals constantly had to wonder, would they be the hunter today, or would they become the next prey? After understanding the perilous world that Homo floresiensis was forced to survive in on Flores Island, a fundamental question begins to become unavoidable. How did those primitive humans arrive here in the first place? Flores is not an easily accessible island. Throughout the hundreds of thousands of years of Pleistocene climate fluctuations, even when sea levels were at their lowest due to glaciation, Flores remained surrounded by deep straits and powerful currents. This meant the island was never fully connected to the Asian continent, unlike many other regions in Southeast Asia. That geographical reality forces scientists to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. Any human species that set foot on Flores must have crossed the sea, whether actively or passively. The most common hypothesis suggests that the ancestors of Homo floresiensis may have been Homo erectus, an archaic human species that left Africa and spread across Asia very early on. Homo erectus fossils found in Java and neighboring regions show they possessed high adaptability and survived for long periods in tropical environments. However, the possibility of Homo erectus actively crossing the sea remains a subject of great controversy. To date, there is no archaeological evidence to prove they possessed boats or genuine maritime technology. Consequently, many researchers lean toward a less active scenario, one that better aligns with the region's natural conditions. According to this hypothesis, a group of Homo erectus may have been swept out to sea by extreme natural events such as massive storms, coastal flash floods, or tsunamis. In such circumstances, they might have clung to vegetation mats, tree trunks, or chunks of land torn from the shore, drifting for days. This was not a planned migration, but an accident of survival. Those who survived such a journey, if they indeed existed, would have reached Flores in a state of exhaustion, unable to return and left with no choice but to adapt. From that moment, their fate was sealed on an isolated island where every mistake carried a lethal price. This absolute isolation created a particularly intense evolutionary pressure. With no external gene flow and no opportunity to interact or expand the population, this small group was forced to adapt to the limited resources and perilous ecosystem of Flores. Over tens of thousands of years, individuals who required less energy and had smaller bodies gradually gained a survival advantage. This process led to the phenomenon often called island dwarfism, a compulsory biological response rather than a sign of degradation. It is important to emphasize that this process did not occur abruptly. Homo floresiensis did not simply wake up one day and find themselves small. They were forced into that form by evolution over countless generations in an environment that did not permit long-term errors. Every change in body size and every adjustment in energy requirements became etched into the population as only the fittest individuals could continue to survive. In that sense, Flores was not just a home, but a closed evolutionary trap. Once they have fallen into this trap, humans no longer have the right to choose their own path. The question is no longer whether they can leave, but rather how long they can survive before this island, along with its ruthless biological laws, demands the ultimate price. As the archaeological traces of Homo floresiensis gradually vanished from the younger soil layers on Flores Island, their story should have ended there. However, a curious detail persists beyond the scope of pure science. The folk legends passed down by the Naga people, the indigenous inhabitants of Flora. In those stories, a creature appears named Ebugogo, meaning the gluttonous grandmother. According to descriptions, the Ebugogo were small, hairy creatures living in caves with a gait similar to humans, who often stealthily stole food from villagers. They could not speak a complete language, only emitting incomprehensible mumbling sounds. Remarkably, these characteristics coincide surprisingly well with the visualization of Homo floresiensis. Of course, there is no scientific evidence to confirm that the Ebugogo were the surviving hobbits, and this point must be clearly emphasized. However, that similarity raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Is it possible that modern humans set foot on Flores while Homo floresiensis had not yet completely gone extinct? If that ever happened, It would be one of the very few moments in history when two different human species coexisted on the same island. We do not know whether they communicated, conflicted, or simply stayed away from one another. Every scenario remains mere speculation, but the question itself is enough to make the story haunting. Scientifically, the more widely accepted hypothesis for the extinction of Homo floresiensis involves major volcanic events on Flores Island that occurred approximately 50,000 years ago. These eruptions may have devastated the vegetation, collapsed the food chain, and pushed an already fragile population to the ultimate brink. With their small numbers and inability to migrate, Homo floresiensis had almost no chance of recovery after a disaster of such scale. Imagine their final days. Ash and dust covered the forest. Food sources were depleted, and the caves that were once safe havens now became cramped, dark spaces. No rituals, no historical milestones, only the quiet disappearance of a branch of humanity that once existed. They were not conquered, they were not remembered, and they left almost no trace in the world's memory. Today, the Earth is home to more than 8 billion people. But there was once a time, not so far back in the flow of evolution, when we were not alone. We shared this planet with another branch of humanity, smaller, more fragile, trapped on an island full of danger, waiting for an escape that would never come. And when they vanished, no one realized that it was the last time the Earth would lose a species of human